Good vintage. Oh, what do you want? I'm above all that now. Haven't you heard? I've got review copies now, son. I'm a rock star, motherfucker.
I think you're full of. I think I'm full of shit. I was so full of. Yeah, I was so full of. I think I'm full of. I think you're full of. I think we're full of shit.
Hello and welcome to All the Games You Like Are Bad. I'm your Cell Hack Shill, Mark Bigney, and today we're going to be talking about Zimby Mojo by Jim Felli. I received this as a promotional review copy for free from the designer, which I think is impressive for him given that he already knew that I didn't like his previous design, Shadows of Malice. Shadows of Malice, mechanically speaking, was unapologetically old school. It featured tons of dice, a lot of procedural dice rolling. There were luck rolls, power rolls, movement rolls, and generally speaking, anytime when you roll for movement, that's a bad sign of things to come. Not necessarily that having a variable movement rate is a problem, but because if you're willing to roll a die at the beginning of every turn to determine how far you're going to go, that indicates, to me at least personally, a bad attitude towards the prevalence of dice rolling overall, which I just find to be tedious. I had the same experience, for what it's worth, with Shadows of Brimstone, so maybe it's something about games with shadows in the title. In fairness, though, Shadows of Brimstone did have a relatively novel take on fantasy adventuring. There weren't any elves or orcs to be seen. Your enemies were monstrous vampiric fish or weirdly mutated tree things, and there was a lot of fresh, new stuff in Shadows of Malice. I just didn't enjoy the gameplay. So when he told me that he had a new game coming out and I looked into it, I knew that at the very least it would be interesting. And here comes Zimby Mojo. Now, Zimby Mojo is it's a game, and in the game, people take turns. There are turns. People take turns doing things in the game. It's a kind of game it's kind of its own thing. And trust me, for someone like me who's played a bunch of games and who prides himself rather too much, obviously, in being able to situate games in their own genre, being unable to come up with fixed points of comparisons for Zimby Mojo is kind of a blow to my own self-image. So good job on that. The designer calls it co-opportunistic, which is a play obviously on cooperative and opportunistic, and it's really quite accurate, and for what it's worth, very novel. More on this all in a moment. First, I'd like to get a small gripe out of the way. The box cover in particular, and the theme more broadly, comes off as a bit racist. I don't think the game is racist, but a lot of the imagery, especially as prevalent in the box cover, trades in a whole bunch of mishmash of stereotypes of various island cultures. You know, mask-wearing, dark-skinned, savage, dim-witted, possibly cannibalistic. These are things that we've been seeing in fiction for generations, and not only do I find it potentially offensive, but I also find it a little bit lazy. Once you get into a little bit more of the lore of the game, you see that zombies aren't human, even though they look really human, and definitely not like white people. There are bird zombies, and bear zombies, and fish zombies, kind of echoes of his view of mutated animals found in Shadows of Malice. And had he leaned more heavily on that, especially in terms of the cover art, and maybe stripped away some of the cultural aspects that are a little evocative of actual Pacific or Polynesian or various other island cultures, I would have been much more comfortable with things. I wish he'd just leaned into the uniqueness rather than trading in kind of tired old potential stereotypes about island people. Anyway, so it's a fantasy game that should really lean more into its fantasy. So let's talk a little bit about how it presents itself further, aside from the social issues. The board looks like something Milton Bradley would have put out 20 years ago. It almost looks like a game of Parcheesi, but the graphic design by Felli in terms of the actual units, I find incredibly charming. He does a lot of his own artwork. He did all the artwork for Shadows of Malice, and he does all the actual game artwork for the pieces in Zimby Mojo. And I really like it. I think it's evocative without being literally representational, and it's kind of cute and charming. So, again, as I said, Zimby Mojo is kind of its own thing. It feels a little bit like a number of games, and I'm going to raise those as they come up, but to preface the description of the game with any of these comparisons, I think would do a disservice to Zimby Mojo insofar as it would both be misleading and kind of undermining how unique it feels oftentimes. So the game consists of two separate yet equally important groups. There's the Zimbies who investigate crimes and the shamans who prosecute the offenders. These are their stories. Wait, no, that's not it at all. Sorry, there are two halves to the game. In the first half of the game, it's kind of sort of semi-cooperative, in that players have to work together to defeat the Cannibal King. However, once his blood-soaked crown hits the dusty ground, it is every person for themselves. And any pretense of cooperation that might have been baked into the system in the first half of the game completely disappears. And it's a mad scramble to get this crown back to your own player board along the edge of the game board. And there, it really is chaotic and hectic and frantic and a game of stabbing your friends and all manner of devious, underhanded shenanigans. So that's what he means when Felli calls it co-opportunistic. You're never really cooperating, but the game forces you to work together in some ways. Now, this is much preferable, in my experience, to semi-cooperative games. I've had bad experiences with semi-cooperative games. I find them often to be very, very fragile, and they introduce unfortunate game mechanics when an individual player is of the opinion, either rightly or wrongly, that they are not able to win by themselves. I experienced this a bit in Archipelago. In Archipelago, you're nominally working together because if things go badly, everybody loses. But if you're not going to win, or if you're in a really bad position, or if you're inclined to take serious risks, you could tank the game for everybody else, and they're not going to have much to say about it. And some people like that dynamic. I find it okay-ish sometimes, but it leads to a certain game fragility. It works all right in Archipelago, so far as I'm concerned. In other games, I don't think it works at all. Dead of Winter, for example, is a semi-cooperative game whereby everybody has a private objective and a public objective. And you only win if you reach your private objective and the public objective at the same time. But sometimes these two are flatly in competition to each other. They're like randomly distributed, and sometimes your private objective is just not realistic, given either the table state or sometimes even what the scenario is. So there's an imbalance there that I find unsatisfying, and if you're in a position where you really know that you're not going to be able to succeed, and sometimes it gets flatly obvious, there are varying schools of thought about whether it is legitimate to tank the game to make sure that everybody loses. And I'm sorry, no matter how much you put in the rulebook about how you should play properly or what the proper way to regard a win is, I found in my years of gaming that you can't reason away someone's preferences about win states. You can't tell them that they really should prefer one kind of win over another in some contexts. And semi-cooperative games often bring out that kind of tension. But you don't have this problem in Zimby Mojo. The game forces you to work together. The Cannibal King won't die unless multiple players work together to kill the Cannibal King. And then, once he's dead, you steal his crown, and then only one player can win. So in the game system itself, you have this balance between cooperation and opportunism. And it's really well done. You also get some of the tension of hidden secret goal semi-cooperative games in Zimby Mojo. In the first half of the game, when again, nominally you're all working together, you're scrutinizing everyone's placement. Okay, so why is he putting that unit there? Is that actually to help kill the Cannibal King, or are they already setting up for the Endgame? Are they really working together with me, or are they going to throw me under the bus? Things like that. I'm not going to say it's as good as some of the the top shelf social deduction games or things where tension is built in, but you do get some very, very interesting sort of uneasy cooperation in the first half of the game. And it is the first half of the game that is my favorite. I do prefer the first half of the game to the second half of the game. It's vaguely Cosmic Encounter-esque in that way. In Cosmic Encounter, you're often going to be working together with people for very ad hoc specific goals. And that's one element of the game that I feel is often ignored. It's not so much the negotiation that I like about Cosmic Encounter. It's the fact that you're forced to work together for short-term goals with the understanding that you're going to knife everybody in the end. It's all very specific and short-term. You don't have long-term alliances. In fact, the game precludes the ability to make long-term alliances. Similarly, in Zimby Mojo, because you know that once the second half starts, you don't have any friends anymore, you have that same sense of, well, I'm working with you for now. So the second half part, the part that I like less, is a number of people I've played with have compared it to the dynamics of Munchkin. And that's not entirely fair to Zimby Mojo. I prefer the second half of the game to Zimby Mojo to a game than over a game of Munchkin, but there are some similarities. In that, when somebody is winning, it is the job of the entire table to throw everything they can at that person if it looks like they're going to win on the next turn. and eventually the table's going to get too tired, either mentally or in terms of the resources, to stop somebody, and sometimes that's the person that's going to win. If you happen to be winning when everyone else just peters out, then you might take the game. For what it's worth, that is sometimes also true of Cosmic Encounter. If someone is sitting at one colony away from winning, everyone throws everything they've got. And sometimes you're winning at the wrong time because everybody's got a handful of stuff to stop you. But if you're winning at the time when no one can stop you, you might take the game just because that's the state of the game. As I've said before, I really love Cosmic Encounter, but I do have some problems with it, and that particular element of the endgame can be unsatisfying. Similarly, in Zimby Mojo, the endgame can be unsatisfying. Sometimes somebody wins because they pulled off something really clever. They prepared properly for the second half of the game, they managed to manipulate people during that cooperative part, and then when they win, you really feel like they took it away and they deserve it. And then sometimes they happen to win because the player whose job it was to stop them wasn't strong enough, or because everyone's run out of steam and nobody can do anything about it. So it's necessary in the system that there be this kind of backstabby element, but sometimes it doesn't pay off as well as it should. Overall, what do I think of the game? Well, I think it's fun, and usually it's very engrossing. But here are the caveats. Number one, it's too long for what it is. It is a solid 30 minutes per player. The solo game is only about 30 minutes long, and you can play with one player. The game box says you can play with 1 to 8, and that is indeed accurate. The one-player game is kind of a game. It's more like a tutorial, and to his credit, the designer says so. I do recommend playing it solo your first time out, though, just so you're able to explain the game. More on that later. The player range is a bit ridiculous because with 2, you don't really get a lot of that interesting dynamic. With 3 players, there are elements of the game system that preclude the interesting elements of the diplomacy. Long story short, you can cooperate with other players and form a unified stack of your little tribesmen Zimbies. And the limit of the number of tribes that can be in a column is 3. So with 3 players, you can, and often will, have a column with everybody in it. And that's not as fun as when you have 4 players, when one person is going to have to be left out. And sometimes you'll have these several multi-tribe columns of Zimbies running around, and they're not all entirely friendly to each other because some of them are excluding player A and some of them are excluding player B. And that dynamic is interesting, and you get that dynamic in a 4-plus player game. And with 4, it's really fun. And every other player past that just keeps larding on length to the game. At 5 players, it's 2.5 hours long. At 6 players, it's easily 3. And let me tell you, that is much too long for my tastes for this game, especially since the end can drag. And it's the end that drags, and the end, as I said, that I find the least interesting, because it's just you play whatever you got to stop somebody from winning. That's the end. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what's going on, to oversimplify things a bit. Another problem with the game is that the rulebook is really, really badly organized. You're going to have to look things up in the game because there are lots of little details and little limitations. You can't make more than 1 zombie a turn. You can't recruit more than 2 Zimbies a turn. You can't have more than 3 Zimbies in a column, and you can't have more than 3 tribes in a Zimby, etc., etc., etc. There are limits on the cannibalism you can do in what context and the different kinds of spells and how they work. So you're going to have to be looking things up, and the rulebook is really, really poorly organized. Another thing that is in the rulebook that Jim Felli does is the rulebook is sort of half, well, not half, more like 3/4 rules explanation and 1/4 flavor and setting of the game. For example, the king, the cannibal king. On every other turn, the cannibal king will activate a random ritual, and the turn after that, every other turn, the king will just go back to the center square and rest. But instead of saying it like that, the rulebook talks about how the Cannibal King needs to rejuvenate his blood mojo by returning to the blood mist and stuff like that. Now, sometimes this is perfectly clear and it just adds to the length of the text, but sometimes it's less clear than it needs to be. You need to remember that the blood mist is a particular kind of terrain tile on the game board. And yes, they're called tiles in this game. They're not called squares, which is another weird element of terminology. And these little bits that just stand in the way of this game being as accessible as it wants to be. And I really think that Jim Felli could take a lesson from the good folks at GMT. When they publish a war game, and war games tend to be very, very big on thematic integration, they'll explain the rule, and then at the very bottom, sometimes in blue italics, they'll explain the thematic reasoning for a rule. They'll say, okay, you can spend X resources to train unit Y, or Y resources to train unit Z. And then at the very bottom they'll say, that's because these units happen to be from Persia and weren't as well trained, something along those lines, rather than leading in with this explanation about Persian doctrines of warfare. So you get that same element of flavor, but it is communicated in a rulebook that is easier to cross-reference and easier to look up in. The game can also get pretty procedural. I complained earlier about how Shadows of Malice, you feel like you're rolling dice all the time, and you're constantly picking up dice and figuring out what the die roll is for. The same is true to a much lesser extent of Zimby Mojo, but sometimes it happens. Let's take a look at what happens when you actually kill the Cannibal King. And I think that gives a pretty good example of how sometimes you can bog down a lot of dice rolls for my tastes. All right, here you are as the yellow player, and your United Colors of Benetton allied stack of Zimbies is now ready to go take out the Cannibal King. You've done your homework, your combat rating is pretty good, and his is pretty bad, and you additionally boost it by casting Jagged Cleavers, which gives you a random amount of combat advantage. Better roll for that. You then make the combat roll, better roll for that, and it turns out that it was good, but not quite good enough. The Cannibal King needs to take a few more wounds, so in response you cast Death Curse, which does a random amount of wounds, better roll for that, but only if it overcomes the King's 50% immunity to any null spells and terrain effects, better roll for that. So congratulations, you kill the king, he drops his crown, you move in, but you move into his space, which is the Blood Mist, which does damage to you, but the crown is now there, so you have a 50% immunity to that terrain, better roll for that. Assuming you do not succeed in being immune, a random Zimmy has to take a wound. You determine it randomly by putting them all into the Bag of Fate, better roll for that, and determining who takes it on the chin, and the one who takes the damage is indeed Red, which is great, because screw Red, he's a jerk, we never liked Red. And now we randomly determine amongst the surviving Zimbies which one actually managed to pick up the crown, because guess what, you thought it was just going to be you, right? Not so simple, and we randomly determine, and it's Red. Oh well, I always supported Red, I supported his efforts to be the new Cannibal King, and now that stack has the crown, and anytime that stack takes damage, of which they probably have a 50% immunity, better roll for that. You then randomly determine who takes the wound, better roll for that, and which of the surviving Zimbies has the new crown, better roll for that. It's also worth noting that the board doesn't really help. For example, you will often be told to determine a random portal through which to teleport your Zimbies. Well, the portals aren't numbered, so every time you roll, you all have to remember that we stipulated, okay, one is in front of me, and we go clockwise from there, or what have you. And sometimes you can forget to do that, in which case you have to engage in stupid little quibbles about, I thought that was number 2. No, that's number 3, that's number 2. They just should have been numbered. The number should have been on the board. And it just adds to the procedural difficulty of doing all these things, and going through the motions can get really, really tedious when you're an hour or two of a relatively straightforward game, and you're just in the you want to get to the interesting and good stuff, but instead you have to work about the random direction that this thug moves in, and the random number of spaces that this zombie moves, etc., etc. And which gets to my real complaint about the game, that for a game of its depth and its arbitrariness, the game is too complicated. There are lots of easy-to-forget little corner cases here and there, and the way that I'll compare it, and this might be a good way of explaining whether you'll like this game, it's like what Phil Eklund would design if he wanted to design a version of Munchkin. It's got pseudo-historical trappings, it's got theme coming off the wazoo, lots and lots of dice rolling, lots of weird stuff happening, with a fair degree of rules, grit, and complexity. I don't like most Phil Eklund games. I feel that there's an awkward disconnect between the sort of hard science theme and a lot of the weird arbitrariness that happens. If that's really what sings to you, and what I've said about Zimby Mojo sounds vaguely appealing, I encourage you to go give it a try. But for me, it's all kind of a near miss. I'm so intrigued by this co-opportunism. I think that balance was really well struck. The fact that there are two phases of the game still using the same game mechanics, and the influence that has on the game state and your player motivations and how you scrutinize the other players, I think that's great, it's wonderful, and it's carried off well. If the second half of the game could be tighter, if the rules could be a bit leaner, if it weren't so bogged down in a lot of these strange edge cases, then I really do think that I could recommend Zimby Mojo. As it is, I find it an intriguing failure, which, artistically, is often more interesting than a solid good design. Even though I don't think Zimby Mojo is going to be a game that I'm going to pull out much, if ever, going into the future, I still prefer something like this than, just to pick a specific name, another Stefan Feld game. Not to say that I hate all his games, but when Stefan Feld releases a game, it's more or less like everything else that he does, and more or less like a lot of other things in the market. But with Jim Felli, even when I don't like what he puts out, it's always at the very least interesting. And that is something that appeals to me. So, I don't know if this sounds like it's a game for you. If it is, give it a shot. If not, stay away. But at the very least, take a look at it, because this is a weird, weird beast, and we could use more weird, weird beasts in a market increasingly driven by derivative and only slightly iterative stuff, rather than considerable improvements on a genre. But hey, maybe you don't like that level of nuance. Maybe you think that I should just decide that it's an awesome game and tell you to buy it, or tell you that it's terrible. I'm sorry, I can't. And I'm not going to. And you're wrong for making me want to do that, but I forgive you. Anyway, thanks very much for watching, and take care.